Hello, very nice to be here and see all of you. As she mentioned, I'm a clinical psychologist. I split my time between both research and clinical practice. What I'm going to be talking to you about today is the sort of information that I discuss with families in clinic a lot when they come to see me. I started out my career specializing in kids with autism and intellectual disability, particularly kids who have more limited language. And I sort of sidestepped my way into now working with a lot of the different rare genetic syndrome groups, since those kids tend to have pretty similar needs. So as I go through, you'll hear me talk about kids with autism and research about kids with autism. I am using that term to refer to the sort of whole spectrum of kids with and without different genetic syndromes who have those same social communication and language challenges. So let's see, where are we at in this presentation? Are we ready? Yes? Okay, looks like we're in the middle of the slides. No worries. Awesome. Okay, so I probably have a little bit too much information here for our time. I'm going to go a little bit quickly through some of it, but I'm happy to chat with any of you guys later if something piques your interest and we don't get a chance to talk about it. And for anybody who's taking pictures of the slides, you're more than welcome to. That's awesome. I do have some pictures of kids in here and some videos of kids, so please don't share pictures that have somebody's kiddo in them, but you can share anything else. All righty, so we're going to be talking in two segments today. I initially offered to give either of these talks, and after discussing with the family groups, we felt like people were interested in all of the information, so I'm trying to consolidate it all into one talk. So I'm going to start out talking about special education and the IEP process, and this is going to be pretty broadly applicable, hopefully, to all of your kids, even those kiddos who do have more language. And then I'm going to shift into talking specifically about supporting kids who have more limited language and the types of supports that we think are going to be most helpful for them. Okay, so a quick background. I actually started out my career as a special ed teacher, and so this is an area that I still focus on a lot as a clinical psychologist to help families understand and navigate this process. Very quick background. Kids with disabilities are protected by federal disability and education law. So the first thing that I want families to understand about the IEP process is that it's a legal process at the end of the day. And if you feel like your kiddo is not getting what they need, or your concerns are not being listened to, you kind of have to think about it a little bit differently than you would think about advocating for medical care or intervention, because this all fits into a legal framework, which is a bit of a different way of thinking about things. And the IEP, the Individualized Education Plan, is essentially the process by which these laws are implemented in your specific case. So you may have heard of a 504 plan. I'll talk about what that is in a minute, but that refers to this law, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which is federal anti-discrimination law. It doesn't have anything to do specifically with schools or kids with disabilities, but it says that any person who has a disability is protected in terms of their ability to engage with publicly funded activities. So this is the law that says that a public library has to have a ramp. It can't only have a staircase because it has to be accessible to everyone. So this does apply to school accommodations as well. And then what you're probably more familiar with is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, which is our federal special education law. And it says that if a student meets one of these categories of disability that are specified in the law, and I'll show you what those are in a minute, and they need specialized support and instruction in order to be able to benefit from education, then they qualify to receive an IEP and get those specialized supports. And the IEP has to be individualized to meet the student's needs. So of all the students out there in the world or in our country, Some subset of those kids are going to be eligible for what we call a 504 plan, protections under 504. And then a smaller set of those kids are eligible under IDEA and qualify for an IEP. A 504 plan is much more general and non-specific. The goal is to provide access to learning. You don't have to meet specific eligibility criteria. Any disabling condition is considered to fall under this plan. There's no specific team of people who have to be involved. There's no standard plan for how it's implemented. It doesn't even have to be written down. It's a very informal process. And the school receives no additional funding for providing services to a child who just has a 504 plan. So from the school's perspective, this is a pretty minimal level of support that fits under a 504 plan. An IEP is a much more official process. It allows for the provision of special education services. You have to meet specific disability categories, which I'll talk about. Can't see my own slides. Can you guys still hear me? Am I not here? I've got a pretty good teacher voice. The IEP team has to include certain people. They're listed there. It has to be a written plan that everyone gets a chance to read and review. And the school does receive additional state funding to provide services for students with IEP. So again, from the school's perspective, this is a much higher level of services that they are then obligated to provide. So the core components that are included in the law, that if your child has an IEP, they should be protected in all these categories. It discusses what appropriate evaluation and assessment looks like, the provision of free and appropriate public education, which is a term you may have heard before, FAPE. We really love our acronyms. The law outlines what should be included in an individualized education plan, that your child has the right to be educated in the least restrictive environment, that the parent and sometimes the student have the right to participate in the decision-making process. And then there are all sorts of procedural safeguards to make sure that these things actually happen. Not that it necessarily always does, but they are written there at least. So we're going to go through these different components and what they all mean. So here's how the process is supposed to work. I know lots of you probably have kids who are older and you've been through this process in a million times, so you can let me know if this ever has worked this way for you. But this is how it's supposed to work. It starts out with someone having a reason for concern about the child. Either the parent is concerned about their development, the teacher raises some concerns, or the child gets a diagnosis from another provider. I might make a diagnosis of autism, and then the parent goes to the school district and says, okay, my child has a diagnosis of autism. And then the parent is going to request an assessment from the school district. Once that happens, the school district has 15 days to put together an assessment plan. The parent then gets 15 days for the informed consent period to make sure they've had a chance to review the assessment plan, ask for any changes, make sure they agree with it. Once the parent consents to the assessment plan, the school has 60 days to complete it. And I've put these timelines in, not because you care about the specifics, but just so you know that there are federally mandated time limits on all of these things. So if you've requested an assessment and the school hasn't followed up with you, know that you have the right to demand that these things happen in the time frame that they're specified. So once they've done the assessment, then you're going to have your first IEP meeting within 60 days of completing that assessment. So the people who assessed your child are going to be there. There's going to be a representative from the administration, often an assistant principal, the special education teacher, maybe also a general education teacher if the child's going to be included. And they're all going to be at the IEP meeting to discuss these assessment findings. If they determine after the assessment that the child meets criteria and is eligible for an IEP, everyone's going to figure out the child's current level of ability, called present levels of performance. Then we're going to figure out their goals. What do we want them to be working on for the next year? what sort of individualized instruction and services will be necessary to meet those goals. And then we're going to determine what the appropriate placement is in the least restrictive environment. Then that plan is going to get implemented for a year. At the end of the year, the IEP is going to get reviewed. You as a parent have the right to request an IEP meeting at any time. You don't have to wait for the annual review, but it is automatically reviewed annually. You guys will meet again, talk about how much progress the child made. Do we need to change anything for the next year? And then every 3 years, there's a process called a triennial, where the child goes through the whole assessment process again to get a more comprehensive look at the progress they're making, and making sure that their IEP is still fitting their needs. So I know it's a ton of information, but that's how the process is supposed to work. If you are requesting an assessment from the school district, always put your request in writing. The school district is required to help you put it in writing if you make a verbal request, but it's best if you go ahead and just put it in writing yourself to begin with. And the school district is then required to comprehensively assess in all areas of suspected disability. So sometimes what will happen is a child will get an evaluation. For example, they may come see me at Children's Hospital Los Angeles. We do a comprehensive evaluation. We might diagnose autism, learning disabilities, ADHD. I write up a 20-page report, and the parent can bring that to the school and say, hey, here's the report, here's the recommendations. The school district is still required to do their own assessment, but it will hopefully be a little bit briefer than it would be otherwise. They are required to look at your outside assessment. So I recommend always sharing that information because it might make the process a little bit easier. I'm going to skip over some of this, but the law includes all sorts of protections for your rights during the assessment. There are all sorts of provisions about making sure that it's a culturally appropriate assessment, that the parent is involved, that it's conducted by qualified professionals. So it can't just be a purely sort of observational, subjective assessment. And then based on that assessment, a child is determined to be eligible for an IEP under one of these categories. And I always just put this up here for parents to understand. If you read these categories, these are not the way medical professionals, psychologists, therapists, or you as parents think about developmental disabilities. And so when you get your child's IEP and it says, for example, that they're eligible under the category of other health impairment, or they're eligible under intellectual disability, or they're eligible under autism and they don't even have a clinical autism diagnosis, it's because these are the only categories that are available for an IEP. So don't worry too much about which one of these categories shows up on your IEP. It really shouldn't make a difference. And the school district just has to figure out which one of these categories best fits your child's needs. And so during the actual meeting, as I mentioned, there are certain people who are required to be there. They can't hold the IEP meeting if they don't, for example, have the administrative designee there. If the assistant principal is out sick and they can't find anybody to cover, then they're actually not allowed to have that IEP meeting until they have all of the people there. Okay, and so assuming that you've made it through the assessment and they've decided that the child is eligible under one of these categories and you're there in the IEP meeting, then what you guys are going to figure out are all of these different components of what the child's individualized education plan is going to be moving forward. And these components are first figuring out, where is the student now? This is their present levels of performance. If you've ever looked at an IEP, it's the first few pages of the document, which summarizes usually some objective standardized test scores, but also the teacher and maybe therapists' observational reports of what the student is able to do in all the different categories. And then where is the student going? What are the goals and objectives for the upcoming year? How will the student get there? What are the services and instruction that are necessary to help the student meet these goals? How are we going to know if the student has succeeded? What types of measurement are we going to use to measure their progress towards these goals? And when are we going to report progress? So the idea that you want to go into the IEP meeting with is that special education is a service, not a place. It can be any sort of additional supports, therapies, classroom supports. It may be a special place. It may be a specialized classroom. It's not necessarily. It's a service that is brought to the student in order to close the gap between the student's present level of performance and their expected level of performance. So again, because we have to put on our legal hats to think about this process. If, for example, you want to advocate for more speech therapy hours for your child, before you get to saying, well, I think he needs 2 times a week speech therapy, not just 1 time a week, we have to start back at this point where we're clearly including in the IEP, what is that child's present level of performance? What are their social communication and language abilities now? And where do we think they can reasonably get to in a year? What is their expected level of performance? And once we've articulated that, it's a lot easier to then advocate for extra services to help them actually meet those goals. But it all starts with very clearly delineating where are they at, where can we reasonably expect them to be in a year. So present levels of performance are written for all of the different academic and functional performance areas. So for kids who are working on an academic curriculum, you should see a present level of performance for all the different academic areas. But we should also see present levels of performance for things like social skills, daily living skills, community skills, behavior, all of those additional areas of functional performance. And you really want to make sure that these are accurate. So one of the things that you as a parent can do to help advocate for your child is that when you're reading those present levels of performance at the beginning of the IEP, if it doesn't sound to you like it's describing your child, then it needs to be modified. As a special ed teacher, I know that, teachers are often doing these very quickly. They have a lot of them to do. They have a lot of students. And sometimes the details don't all make it in there. There's also sometimes pressure to show that students are making progress. And sometimes present levels of performance can get a little bit inflated over time because there's pressure to report that the student met their goals, and then that gets written in the present levels as something the student can do. And before you know it, several years later, the present levels are describing skills that your child actually isn't really doing independently. And then if that baseline of where your child is at isn't accurate anymore, it's going to be hard to advocate for the level of services that they need. So the first thing you should do as a parent is read through the present levels and make sure they actually sound like your child and that they're describing the things that you think your child can and can't do. And then the goals and objectives are going to be the things that we think this child can accomplish within the next year. One of the things that I always recommend for parents to do is to advocate for a good number of goals. Even if you have a child who has really limited abilities, who's working on things very incrementally and needs a lot of time to learn new skills, they should still have lots of different skills they're working on, even if they're only making a little bit of progress at once. I get a little worried when I see an IEP that only has 3 goals in it. You can't convince me that that child is actually going to spend all day, every day, for a year working only on those 3 skills. There must be more things that they're working on, that they're doing during the day. What are they doing during morning meeting? Are they working on turning and saying hi to a classmate? What are they working on during recess? Are they working on learning to stand in a line? Are they working on learning to respond to verbal instructions? All of those things should be in the IEP as goals. Since goals, legally speaking, are the major factor in determining services and placement, you really want to make sure that you get the team to write a comprehensive set of goals that's really going to represent what the child's doing during the year. I would much rather see 15 very minimal goals than 3 goals that the child's unlikely to even achieve because they're too far away. Once you got a really good comprehensive set of goals and you feel like, okay, this represents a year of being at school. I can imagine my child going to school and working on all these things, and this would fill up a day. Then it's finally time to talk about what are the appropriate services, the intensity of those services, and then what's the placement, what type of classroom is going to best fit now this child's needs. So we want goals that are specific, measurable, include some sort of action. We don't want passive goals, that are realistic for the child and are time limited. So again, this goes back to what I was saying about, I would rather see 15 goals with incremental progress. Because if we're writing a very specific, measurable goal that's reasonable for that child to accomplish, then we're going to be able to actually work on it over the year and measure the progress that they're making. And we're all going to have a much better understanding of where they're at, what their development is looking like, and what their needs are. Sometimes we see very general goals that say things like, Johnny will refrain from screaming when frustrated, which is an actual IEP goal that I inherited once. And I was like, well, so first of all, Johnny has to get frustrated in order to work on this goal, right? Because the goal is to refrain from screaming when frustrated. Secondly, Johnny doesn't say anything about what he's supposed to do. He's just supposed to refrain from screaming. How are we really even going to measure that? And what are the chances, given that Johnny currently screams about 15 times a day, that we're actually going to get down to 0? That seems like an unlikely goal for him. Can we come up with something more specific, like Johnny is going to ask for a break when he becomes frustrated during X, Y, and Z activity with a reminder from the teacher? Then that's very specific. It's something he might actually be able to do. It's building a new skill, and we can measure that progress over time. Transition planning, I'll just touch on real quickly and say that it is mandated to start by age 16. But it can start as early as 14. I don't think there's ever any harm in starting to think about it early. So I recommend that parents always request at least starting to talk about transition planning when their child turns 14, because you might as well start understanding what the different pathways and options are, and not wait until you have less time to consider those things. And then related services are things like speech therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy, adaptive physical education, assistive technology. It's all those additional things outside of just your regular classroom curriculum that our kiddos typically have in their IEPs. And again, to help you guys advocating for your kids, if you're trying to advocate for additional related services, either increased hours or a new service that your child doesn't already have, it's not enough just to say that the child would benefit from the service. A lot of times, parents or advocates or providers will say the child would benefit from increased speech therapy. Well, probably half the school would benefit from some type of service that they're not getting. again, because this is a legal process, what you have to demonstrate is not just that the child would benefit, but that it's actually necessary, that increased level of services is necessary in order for them to make progress towards their goals, to access the general education curriculum, to participate in school activities, to participate with their peers. So we have to actually make the case that 1 hour a week of speech therapy is not sufficient. They're not going to make appropriate progress. They require the second hour in order to make that appropriate progress that we think is expected for their development. And then, even though people often think about this first, this is really supposed to come at the end of the process. Once we've got all of that information figured out, then the placement conversation should happen, where we figure out, okay, now that we have a really good understanding of what this child's needs are, what sort of services they require, what their goals are going to be, then we have to figure out where in this continuum of placements is the best place for this child to make sure that their needs are being met. The law protects kids' right to be in the least restrictive environment, meaning that just because someone has an IEP does not automatically mean that they have to go to a special classroom. They have the right to be educated in the least restrictive environment where they can be successful. For some kids, that might mean being in the general ed classroom with either some push-in supports where someone goes in and helps them, or some pull-out supports where maybe they go to the resource room once a day to get some extra help with things. For some kids, that might be a special education classroom within a public school. So there are typically developing kids on the campus, but there's a separate classroom where kids are working on a different pace, a different curriculum. It's often a smaller number of kids in that classroom. And then if that's not successful, some kids may attend a specialized school where there's a higher level of specialized programming and training and focus on supporting kids with disabilities. And then for kids who can't really benefit from any of those environments, especially kids who have a lot of medical complexities. Sometimes we see kids who are educated in a home program or who are in a hospital or residential program, either because of very, very severe behaviors or because of medical needs that make attending a regular school program unsafe. So that was a not very quick crash course in special education and the IEP process. Since I'm switching topics, I'm actually going to pause there for a minute and see if there are any burning questions or things you were confused about before we switch to talking about communication. Are we going till 3:45? Okay.
I have a question. As parents, I always feel that we are at such a disadvantage about the amount of information that the school system knows and what we know. So do you have any recommended resources so we can get more of an education on these sort of things?
So there's a great website called Rights Law, WRITE, I think, that has relatively parent-friendly information about all this that I just talked about, all the sort of legal background of how this process works. My biggest piece of advice is to just take your time. Don't ever feel pressured to sign an IEP in the moment if you didn't feel great about how the meeting went. Take it home, take your time to read it, ask some other people to read it. Get feedback. If your child has other providers outside of the school system, get feedback from people about, hey, does this match up with how you think about my child? What do you think about these things? The school district is absolutely required to let you have drafts of these things and to let you take your time in thinking about it and then reconvene the IEP meeting when you feel like you have a better understanding of how you want to move forward.
Hi, my name is Christy, and what recommendations would you have for if your child is in like a special education room and you think it would be necessary for them to be in like the general education room? And my opinion versus the school's opinion is different. What recommendations would you give for me to advocate for the child?
I'll give you actually very similar advice to what I gave her, which is that you should ask for feedback from other people who work with your child, who know your child, to have some additional information to present to the school. Sometimes kids' behavior within the school environment can be very different from at home or in a clinic environment or out in the world. And so sometimes giving this the best possible interpretation, that the school's not just being annoying, that they have justification for their perspective. Sometimes it can be really helpful to gather information from everyone who sees the child in different places and understand, like, what's the whole scope of this child's needs and behavior across different environments. How can we all get on the same page about what's going to be the best fit for them? But at the end of the day, I mean, you do have the right to disagree. You have the right to hire an advocate. You obviously don't want to get to that point, but you can, if you really feel like their perspective on your child is just not accurate. Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to move us along if that's okay. We'll have hopefully a little more time for questions at the end, and then I'll be at the fireside chat, and then I will also talk with you guys afterwards if anyone has other questions. Okay, so we're going to shift gears now a little bit, and we're going to talk about strategies for promoting communication in kids who have more limited language. So this is where we're going to get to the part of the talk where I'm going to start talking about autism a lot, because that's the body of research that we have. I know that not all of your kiddos have an autism diagnosis, and of course, not all kids with autism have a genetic diagnosis. But for the most part, this group of minimally verbal or limited language kids with autism does represent actually quite a lot of these genetic syndromes, as we've identified more and more genetic syndromes. These kids who up until now have just had a diagnosis of autism and maybe intellectual disability, we're starting to recognize more and more that they have these genetic diagnoses. So I think the research we have on minimally verbal autism is still very applicable. So of the whole autism population, about a quarter of kids are still minimally verbal by the time they get to school age. Like I said, lots of these specific genetic syndromes have this profile. And when I say minimally verbal or limited language, I'm including kids who don't use any spoken language at all, or kids who do use some spoken language, but it's limited and restricted in terms of what they are able to express. We know that there's tons of variability in early language development. When I'm working with young kids who either have a new genetic diagnosis or have a diagnosis of autism, parents, of course, the first question they all have is my child going to learn to talk? When will they learn to talk? And honestly, as a researcher, that's the question that I've been most interested in trying to answer, is understanding this variability in language development. Overall, again, in the group of kids with autism, so representing lots of different genetic etiologies and some non-genetic, the average age of first words is past age 3. It's 38 months. So if your kiddo is 2 or 3 and they're not talking yet, we know that they haven't even reached the average age of first words yet for this group. So we have lots of optimism for their future language development. We also know that of kids who get to the preschool age with limited language, about 70% of those kids, so most of them, by the middle of elementary school, are going to be speaking in at least phrase speech. So not necessarily age appropriate, but there used to be sort of an expectation in the field that if a child wasn't talking by age 5, that they were probably going to stay nonverbal. And we know now that that's not the case. The kids develop language for a long, long time, much longer than we used to think. So if your child is not yet speaking or is using only minimal language, there's no reason to believe that they're just suddenly going to stop and never learn a new word. Their trajectory is probably going to continue being slower. A child who's not talking at age 7 is probably not going to be speaking fluently at age 10, but we do expect them to continue making progress. In terms of making our best guess about whether or not a child is going to learn to talk, when we look at big groups of kids, some predictors of language outcomes are kids who use more joint attention, who are coordinating their attention with other people, and I'll talk more about joint attention in a minute. Kids who are using gestures, so pointing, waving. Kids who have better motor skills and imitation skills. Kids who are having better nonverbal cognitive development, and then kids who make a range of different sounds. Those are all good predictors for future language development. And really, when I'm looking at one individual child, what I'm looking for is, are we still seeing some slow progress and some change in their language development? Or are we seeing that they were making progress for a while and now it's been a few years of skills being really consistent and kind of a plateau, in which case I might be more likely to think, okay, they may actually have reached the point of expressive language development that they're going to get to, and we should be thinking about some alternative modes of communication. But if a child is still adding new skills, even if it's at a very slow pace, there's no reason to think that's going to stop. They will probably continue adding skills at that pace. So joint attention is incredibly foundational for language learning and for all learning. It's the active coordination of shared attention between a partner and an object. So we are all jointly attending to these slides right now. You guys are looking back and forth between me and the slides. I'm looking back and forth between you and the slides. We all know that the slides are what I'm talking about. We're jointly attending to the slides. Even in typical development, how much time a child spends in this sort of jointly engaged state is predictive of their language development trajectory. It's just incredibly powerful. It's how kids learn. And so a lot of the newer behavioral interventions for autism focus a lot on promoting joint engagement. How can we get kids more engaged in interactions with us so that even if I'm not sitting down and teaching them one word after another, we're just working on play routines and trying to keep them engaged and interactive with me. That's going to be helpful for their overall language development, just being in those interactions. This is a great picture here. This little guy, his name is Parker. He's probably like 15 years old now. And this is during an intervention session. That's me with the ponytail and his mom with straight hair. And we've been working on parent coaching, and I was teaching her to respond to all of Parker's more subtle communication bids. And so he kind of held up these bristle blocks. He wasn't clearly orienting them to us. It wasn't clear that he was trying to get our attention, but we both spontaneously pointed and labeled the blocks at the exact same time, which was a great moment of triple joint attention there. But one of the great things that you guys can do for your kids, whether they're not using any language at all or whether they're just more limited communicators, is try to notice the subtle things that they're doing to communicate. Respond to that. Make that a moment of joint attention. Is your child looking over this way and vocalizing? You can come around and also orient to what they're looking at and label it and look at your child. And even if the moment only lasts 5 seconds, it's still that little moment of connection. Because our kiddos often have a hard time following our attention and engaging in what we're looking at. We can make it easier for them by shifting to what they're already looking at and trying to have some engagement around that. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip over this. This is some pilot data about increasing engagement, but even with kiddos who have different genetic syndromes, who have really limited skills, we can get them to engage in these sorts of activities. And then I want to move now to talking about the power of alternative modes of communication and how important it is to incorporate that for kids. So I'm going to show you a quick little example. How do I play this? Okay, well, let's see what happens. Seems like we do not have sound. Oh. Okay, so this first video clip this is a kiddo named Joseph. If we could go backwards and play that one more time with the sound up a little higher, maybe. Could you guys hear it? So all you're gonna hear one of our intervention studies with a researcher UCLA on a category that a million years ago when I was doing the PhD. Build. And this is at the time of this study in real whatsoever. And you can see that looks like a particularly well organized more than he said. Some kids obviously seem to understand a lot more than they say. Joseph didn't necessarily present that way. He was pretty dysregulated, pretty into his kind of self-directed, repetitive behaviors. So my point with this clip is just to highlight, sometimes kids who don't look like they're understanding a lot can still really be understanding a lot. Joseph's mom is the sweetest and has kept in touch with us over the years. And a few years ago, right before COVID, he came back for an updated evaluation. And he is now using an iPad to communicate. Joseph, now we're going to do some words. So I need you to type your answers. He first used a speech output device that was picture-based. And he eventually transitioned to actually just typing words, and you'll see here he types words on his tablet to communicate. And so this is 5 years afterwards. His nonverbal IQ is still about the same. It's still about 50, but his receptive vocabulary at that first time when he was 7 years old was below before the test. We couldn't measure it. It was below an age equivalent of 2 years. And now, 5 years later, his receptive vocabulary has grown by about 3 years, which is amazing progress. He can now show us that he understands quite a lot of things. And so I apologize for the poor video quality. I didn't realize what a great video this is going to turn out to be. So I didn't plan it well. But here, what we're doing is a standard verbal IQ test that I would do with a typically developing kid, where I'm asking Joseph to define different words, and he's going to type his answers on the tablet. He's never done this kind of assessment before, and I decided we would just give it a try. And I want you guys to see what he's able to do. Okay, so you can turn that on for me. I'm going to tell you a word, and you tell me what it means, okay? Okay?
Yes.
All right. What are scissors? Yeah, can you type it? Tell me what scissors are. Are we giving up on this? Now we're going to do some words, so I need you to type your answers. Okay, so you can turn that on for me. I'm going to tell you a word, and you tell me what it means, okay? Okay?
Yes.
All right. What are scissors? Yeah, can you type it? Tell me what scissors are. Yeah, what are they? What does scissors mean? So first he typed the word scissors, which makes sense. Yeah, you use glue with scissors, that's true.
Then he typed glue, which
Now
is a
tell
nice
me,
association
what
with
is,
scissors.
good job. What is a bed? You tell me, what is it?
Sleep.
Good job. Bed is something you sleep in.
I asked him what a bed is, and he typed
What
sleep,
does travel mean?
asking him what travel means. Thinking really hard.
Yeah, travel.
Travel.
What does that mean when you travel?
Typed
What is
travel.
I know, it's tricky, huh? Yeah, okay.
Trip.
Yeah, good job.
And then he typed trip as the definition for travel. So this is certainly not, age appropriate fluent language for a 12-year-old, but this is incredible progress from where he was as a 7-year-old. And he's able to show us that he has a conceptual understanding of these verbal concepts that when he was 7, he couldn't show us that he understood any of that. So, this is just one random example of a kiddo who I was lucky enough to follow over the years to see his progress. But my perspective is that we don't know how many kids could make the kind of progress that Joseph has made because we don't give that opportunity to all of the kids. You would never have predicted from Joseph's test scores and his behavior when he was 7 that he was going to become a really intelligent verbal communicator. He still doesn't really talk. He does say some words, but when he walked in, his mom said, "Do you remember Charlotte?" And he typed, "Yes, I do. Hi, Charlotte," on his tablet. So, we never would have guessed when he was 7 that that was the trajectory he was going to be on. And so as a researcher, what I focus on is trying to understand how could we have known that that was what he was capable of, and how can we get more kids there? As a clinician, I focus with families on trying to empower you guys to use these same strategies with your kids, even if you're not necessarily getting buy-in from all the teachers and therapists who work with your kids, to at least feel like you can start working on some of this stuff on your own. Because if Joseph's mom hadn't decided that she thought he was capable of that and worked with him, I don't think the school was ever gonna just hand him an AAC device and figure out that he was capable of that. It really took her doing it to prove that he was capable. So really quickly, because we're about out of time, AAC, augmentative and alternative communications, can apply to any additional nonverbal thing we do to communicate. So that can include what are called unaided systems, like using sign language. But more often with our kids, we use aided systems. Some kids might start out with something low tech, like pictures that are laminated and Velcroed on a board. Or we might use something high tech like a speech output device. It used to be much harder, for families to get access to a high tech device because it was a very expensive proprietary kind of standalone device. You may have heard of something like a Dynavox, which was several $1,000s. But now that tablet computers, things like iPads and other tablets are available, parents are often saying, all right, forget it. I can't get the school to authorize an AAC device. I can't find a speech therapist who seems comfortable working on it. I'm just going to get an iPad and I'm going to download an app and I'm going to start working on it on myself. So that's the context in which I end up talking to parents about this a lot. I would love for them to have professionals who are working with their kids on these things, but sometimes that just isn't happening in a timely manner. And so parents are making it happen themselves. So here is, in just a few minutes, my sort of overview that I do with parents in clinic a lot. So hopefully this will be helpful for some of you guys. The first thing to know is that using any sort of AAC is not going to inhibit your child's language development. It's only going to promote it. There's no concern that the child will stop speaking or won't learn to speak because you're using another system. If you think about it, in typical development, your communication skills and your speech skills develop together. As you're learning to talk, you're learning to have more interactive communication, and those skills are developing together. In our kids with limited language, their speech skills are stuck. They're taking longer to develop. But that doesn't mean that their communication skills also have to be stuck. What we want is to give the child other modes of communication so that those communication skills can develop as far as they can. And then if the speech comes along, great. They're going to be able to map that speech onto their more advanced communication skills. So that's sort of the premise for why we think alternative communication is so important. As I said, it doesn't impede spoken language development. If anybody wants a research article so they can prove to their kid's teacher that it's not true, I will happily send you some. If I accomplish one thing in my career, it will be this. I also hate the concept of prerequisite skills. And I should say, for any of you guys and for anyone listening on Zoom, I'm not a speech and language pathologist. I don't claim to be. I'm coming at this from a little bit of a different perspective. But I hate the concept of prerequisite skills for a child to qualify for having an AAC device. Instead, I like to think of these as areas where we need to understand what the child's abilities are so that we can make sure we're using a device that's appropriate for their abilities and we're using it in a way that's appropriate for their abilities. I don't think it should be a routing where we say, nope, you're not developed enough. We're not doing AAC. Instead, these are things that we need to take into consideration when we're choosing what and how to use it. So motor skills, can the child manipulate a touch screen? iPads can be very finicky with the way you have to sort of touch and release and not drag your finger. And so we need to know if the child can do that or not. Visual discrimination, are they seeing the difference between similar pictures? If you've ever looked at any of these speech output apps and the sort of built-in symbol library, a lot of them have very, very visually similar pictures for different words. That might not be the best way to go if the child isn't noticing the difference between those pictures. Cause and effect. Do they understand the relationship between their actions and the consequences in the environment? Do they know that when they vocalize, it gets someone's attention and maybe that person will figure out that they want a cookie? Or are they still at that stage of unintentional communication where they're just vocalizing because they're distressed, but not because they're trying to get an idea across to you? So we need to know where they're at. And then symbolic representation. Do they understand that a picture or a symbol is related to the real world object? Does it make sense to them that this picture of a cookie on the screen is related to the real cookie in the world that they want? If they don't yet understand that relationship, then we need to do some work to make sure that they start to make that association, or the AAC device is just going to be totally abstract to them and useless. So the most important thing is that we introduce it at their level. The worst thing to do is hand a kiddo a tablet that's way too complicated for them. They're going to hit all the buttons. They're not going to know what they mean. They're going to get frustrated and chuck it. They're going to try to back out of the speech program and find YouTube, and you're not going to get anywhere. It would be better to start with something that is actually too simple for them than to start with something that's too complex. So again, if you're doing this on your own and you've downloaded one of these apps, I would not ever start with their sort of built-in templates. They're almost always too complex for our kiddos to start with. You want to start with something very, very, very simple, make sure it makes sense to them, and then slowly build it up. And I'm going very quickly now in the interest of time, so I'm happy to chat with you guys later. So make sure that the display is set up to be not too visually overwhelming to them. Make sure it has vocabulary that is meaningful to them. We want to start with things that the child actually wants to say. So a lot of people start with, I want my child to be able to tell me if he's in pain. Okay, but does your child know what that means? If he hasn't developed that concept yet and he's not going to recognize that picture, then that probably isn't going to be a successful initial communication. That is definitely a goal we want to work towards. But if what the child really wants to say is, I want to watch Sesame Street, then that's what we need to have on the tablet to start with, so that he starts to understand what this means, what communication is, and then we can work towards those more abstract concepts. You want to make sure that if you're using some sort of speech output device, that other people in the child's environment are also using it. If you think about it, it's really weird to expect a kid to learn a mode of communication that no one else is using. So what we encourage you guys to do, and what we do in intervention sessions is, if we're playing with the child and I'm saying, let's build, I'm also going to reach over to the device and touch build at the same time that I say it, so that the child starts to understand, oh, that's a mode of communication. She's telling me something with this tablet. Always continue to respond to their other forms of communication. We don't want the child to learn that we're only going to respond to the device. We want them to learn that we respond anytime they try to communicate with us, and that communication is powerful no matter what mode it's in. And it doesn't need to be all day. Sometimes parents get the message that, okay, we're going to start using Proloquo. We're going to carry the tablet with us everywhere. We're going to use it all day. And that is really, really overwhelming and not reasonable for anybody to do. So I would start by identifying a couple time periods during the day where you feel like it's going to be meaningful. It's going to be easy to fit in. Sometimes this is things like meal time, where it's kind of predictable. You know what the child's going to ask for. You can use it during shared book reading if that's something your child likes to do. Any sort of predictable routine or activity is where you want to start. And don't be afraid to start with just those times. And don't hold yourself to having to do it all day, every day, because you won't be able to, and it'll make you crazy. There are all sorts of tech things you can do to make it a little easier to sort of lock the iPad or another kind of tablet into just that program, so the kids can't back out and get to YouTube. And I think I will go ahead and stop there because we are out of time. So let's see, do we want to do a couple of questions, or do we want to just go straight to the group? Okay, perfect. So we are going to stop there. We are going to go straight to the fireside chat, where I will be with the speakers who were right before me, and we can do more questions over there.